Mate, you want to run that out for us?
All right.
I reckon just around where the fork of the tree is there, eh?
Okay.
Yeah, just in through under there if you can.
Yeah.
All right, stand back just in case, eh? You ready?
Ready.
The Yukon is a place that doesn't forgive mistakes. It's wild, frozen country where you either find your fortune or the land swallows you whole. For more than a century, people have been chasing gold through its valleys, rivers, and ridges, leaving behind broken machines, broken families, and sometimes no trace at all. And yet, here comes the Mackie family, walking into one of the most feared stretches of ground in the north, determined to do what nobody else has done. Before we get into what they found, make sure to like and subscribe, because this is one story you won't want to miss. They weren't just hunting gold, they were chasing a ghost. The place they set their sights on has a name most miners don't even say out loud without a drink in their hand: the Devil's Draw. It's a narrow gorge cut deep into the earth, the kind of place that looks wrong even at a glance. Locals talk about it like a bad omen. Claims filed there always went bust, equipment was lost, and in some cases, whole crews vanished. People swear the valley takes more than it gives, and if you ask the old-timers in the bars of Dawson, they'll tell you that the land there isn't cursed. It's just hungry. The Mackies heard all of it. They knew the stories, but they didn't see a curse. They saw unfinished business. Old maps suggested something was still down there, something missed or abandoned in the rush to the next strike. So when they walked into that gorge, they weren't just digging for gold, they were digging into a piece of Yukon history that had been left to rot. Rusted claim stakes still stuck out of the frozen soil, tilting at strange angles, like markers for men who had tried and failed. And when the first shovels bit into the ground, the sound echoed through the canyon like a gunshot. For a moment, the entire family just listened to it, standing in silence, as if the earth itself was letting them know it hadn't forgotten. The ground was unforgiving. Beneath a thin skin of snow and frost lay layer after layer of compacted ice, harder than concrete and twice as dangerous. The Mackies brought in heavy gear to start breaking through, but even before they could get to work, they began to see signs that confirmed the rumors. Reports from geologists years earlier had hinted at a strange mineral streak lying underneath the ice, something long and narrow that didn't look natural. It was said to be a ribbon vein, a continuous line of quartz and ore, rich enough to turn a small crew into millionaires. Old journals from prospectors in the early 1900s described flashes of gold like lightning trapped underground. The deeper they dug, the more the earth fought back. Each scoop of the excavator made the ice fracture like broken glass. The walls shifted and groaned, threatening collapse with every vibration. Sometimes the ground seemed to sigh, almost like it was alive and didn't want to be disturbed. And then came the most dangerous part. Sensors began picking up trapped gas under the frozen soil. Methane. If it leaked and ignited, the whole gorge could turn into a fireball. Everyone knew it. Everyone could feel the risk building with every foot they pushed into the frozen rock. And still, nobody quit. There's something about the promise of gold that makes men stubborn. The Mackies weren't just testing the ground, they were testing themselves. Each time they dug deeper, the questions grew louder. Were they chasing fortune, or were they chasing a story that had already claimed too many lives? Some in the family wondered aloud if this was the kind of ground worth walking away from. But that wasn't Kevin Mackie's way. He believed if they'd come this far, they had to see it through. Then the machines began to fail. The Yukon winter is merciless, and it doesn't care how good your equipment is. One morning, The excavators simply froze where they stood. The hydraulics locked solid. Diesel lines cracked like brittle twigs, and entire systems went dead. They tried to warm them with heaters, with open flames, with anything they could manage, but nothing seemed to hold. A supply truck, carrying spare parts, skidded off an icy ridge and was lost, setting them back days. Every breakdown was another nail in the coffin of the expedition. The camp itself began to unravel. Tempers flared as hours were wasted, and arguments broke out about whether to push on or admit defeat. For some, it seemed insane to risk their lives for what might only be a story told by old men in a bar. But for Kevin, the leader of the family, there was no middle ground. He told them plainly, "If we turn back now, we might as well bury ourselves here." It wasn't bravado. It was the way he saw it. All or nothing. That kind of conviction is contagious, even when it borders on madness. The rest of the family knew the risks, but they also knew that walking away would haunt them forever. They had already broken into ground that hadn't been touched in generations. They had already seen the first glimmers of promise. To stop now would be worse than failure. It would mean surrendering to the same fear that had driven off everyone else who had tried. And so, in the middle of snowstorms, with machines frozen solid and fuel running low, the Mackies kept digging. With every swing of the pick, every shovel scraping against ice, they pressed further into the devil's draw. The ground resisted them at every step, but something about the way the ice fractured, the way the rocks shifted, told them they were close. Close to something that had been waiting under the frozen Yukon earth for over 100 years. Close to the streak that would change everything. But sheer muscle could only take them so far. The ground was fighting back harder than their tools could answer, and even their conviction had limits. That was when they turned to technology, one final gamble to see beneath what stubborn ice refused to give up. Out came the ground-penetrating radar, equipment that could look beneath the permafrost without digging another inch. The family gathered around the monitor as pulses were fired into the earth, each wave returning a hidden picture of what lay below. Slowly, the ghostly outline of the valley emerged on the screen. But it was the streak that made their hearts stop. Running sideways beneath the valley floor, twisting and jagged like a lightning bolt frozen in rock, was a dense formation unlike anything they'd ever seen. At its widest point, the formation glowed bright on the scan, a signal of heavy mineral content. The signature was unmistakable. Gold. Not scattered flakes, not a random pocket, but a vein. Thick, continuous, and possibly untouched. Someone had seen it before, though. Kevin pulled out a tattered prospector's logbook from 1898, found in Dawson years earlier. The hand-drawn maps inside showed a collapsed tunnel leading into this very gorge. The old miner's notes described a strike that ended too soon, cut off by disaster when the tunnel caved in on itself. The sketches matched the radar scans almost perfectly. What the Mackies were seeing was the same vein those men had been chasing more than a century ago. The choice became clear. They wouldn't carve a new path and risk scattering the gold. They would reopen the tunnel, picking up where the past had left off. It was a decision heavy with risk. Nobody knew what condition the old shaft was in, or what dangers lay inside after 100 years of abandonment. But that was the gamble, the same one every miner makes when chasing a fortune. Step forward, or let history bury the chance forever. Work began at once. Reinforced beams were hauled into the gorge and hammered into the earth, creating a skeletal frame strong enough to hold back the pressure of frozen ground. Steel by steel, the pathway was rebuilt, and slowly the old entrance took shape. The Mackies worked with a reverence that made even the youngest among them quiet. Every strike of the hammer echoed down into the frozen spine of the earth, as though announcing their return. When the first passage was cleared enough to enter, Kevin led the way. The air inside was colder than the world outside, sharp and biting, like a century of winter had been locked inside, waiting for release. Each step forward felt like trespassing into another century. Their headlamps flickered across relics that had been left behind: rusted lanterns, collapsed rail carts, pieces of shattered gear. On the walls were initials scratched into the rock, the only surviving marks of men who had walked into the shaft and never walked out. It was a reminder that this place had already demanded payment in lives. The deeper they went, the more the shaft revealed. It ran straight down for what felt like forever, the ground swallowing them step by step. Finally, after dropping more than 100 feet, the tunnel opened into a cavern carved by both nature and man. Frost clung to the walls like crystal, glimmering in their lights, and behind it, something shimmered faintly. Veins of quartz cut through the cavern rock, and in the quartz, tiny flashes pulsed like stars. The promise of gold, not legend, not rumor, but the real thing, sleeping just below their fingertips. The family wasted no time. Tools were unpacked, pans filled, and the first tests began right there in the cavern. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the pans glittered with visible flakes, unmistakable and rare. The kind of flakes that tell a miner he's not just close, he's standing on the thing itself. One bucket came up heavier than the rest, its bottom layered with coarse gold. When they weighed it, the scale told the truth: nearly 25 ounces. In today's market, that was more than $40,000 pulled from a single bucket of dirt. The Mackies looked at one another, hardly able to believe it. This wasn't the fine dust they were used to finding, the kind you need gallons of dirt to produce. These were jagged, heavy pieces, gold that had formed in pockets untouched by man or time. Every prospector dreams of nuggets like these, and here they were, spilling out of the earth in handfuls. It was the kind of strike that changes a family forever. But news like this never stays quiet for long. Already there were whispers moving through the Yukon, hints spreading through bars and supply shops. People were asking questions about why the Mackies had gone into the Devil's Draw, about what they'd seen, what they'd found. Rival crews began sniffing around, some sending scouts up into the ridges above the gorge to watch from a distance. The Mackies knew they had stumbled on more than just a lucky pocket. They had found a vein, a frozen river of gold that had been waiting more than a century to be rediscovered. Kevin summed it up in a single line, spoken low so only the family could hear. "We found the river, frozen in stone." It wasn't a boast. It was a warning, the kind of words that tell you once you've crossed this line, there's no going back. And with rivals closing in, they had only one choice: push harder, faster, louder, until the ground itself yielded before anyone else could take it from them. The days blurred into each other as the Mackies turned the gorge into a living machine. Sleep was no longer a luxury, just a memory. They ran their sluices around the clock, day bleeding into night, with the same rhythm of dirt, water, and gold. Trays filled faster than they could be weighed, the glitter of coarse nuggets spilling across metal like gravel on a road. Every time a cleanup was finished, more piles waited behind it, the earth giving up its treasure in a relentless stream. By the third day, the numbers defied belief. Over 2,000 ounces pulled out, nearly $4 million in gold, stacked into buckets, jars, and crates. The weight of it bent the tables, made their arms ache, but no one dared stop. The fever had them. Even as fuel tanks ran low, they kept feeding dirt to the wash plant by hand, one bucket after another, rationing diesel like medicine. Every gallon was stretched to its limit. Every machine pushed until its gears screamed. Exhaustion chewed at them, faces hollowed, eyes bloodshot, hands blistered and raw. Some collapsed in their boots, sleeping where they stood for a few minutes before being shaken awake to keep the line moving. The strain pulled at family bonds, voices rising in frustration, tempers snapping under pressure. But whenever the gold appeared in the trays, the anger dissolved into silence. It was impossible to argue with a fortune glittering right in front of you. For better or worse, the gold had locked them in its grip. The deeper they dug, the more the story changed. Core samples drilled into the rock told a truth larger than any of them expected. The streak didn't stop where the scans had suggested. It ran deeper, spreading under ridges beyond their claim, threading through the earth like a vein in a living body. The geologists shook their heads as the samples came back, each one showing high purity levels, the kind that doesn't fade out, but stretches on and on. But fortune came tied to danger. The engineers warned them plainly, keep mining at this pace and the gorge could turn on them. Overcutting the ground risked destabilizing the slopes. One wrong blast, one section taken too aggressively, and the entire camp could be swallowed in a landslide. The warnings grew louder when a methane pocket ignited during a routine dig. For a split second, the tunnel roared with blue flame, a silent fire tearing across the frost before vanishing into smoke. The cavern walls blackened, the air tasted like metal, and the crew stood frozen, realizing how close they had come to vanishing in an instant. Still, every cleanup tray held more gold than the last. Nuggets the size of thumbnails, coarse gravel coated in yellow, the kind of yield that miners can go lifetimes without seeing. To stop digging seemed impossible, like telling a drowning man not to reach for air. The Mackies gave the vein a name, the serpent's spine, a line of fortune coiled through the frozen earth, glittering and deadly in equal measure. A treasure? Yes, but a curse just as surely, curling tighter around them with every ounce they pulled out. And then came the outsiders. Rumors moved faster than ice can crack, spreading through Dawson, Whitehorse, and the camps beyond. Stories of the Mackies pulling gold by the bucket, stories of a strike bigger than anything since the Klondike Rush itself. Soon, the ridges above the gorge weren't empty. Pickup trucks were seen at night, engines idling with their lights off, watching from the shadows. Drones began buzzing overhead, their faint hum following the crew during long shifts. It was no longer just the land they had to fight. It was the eyes of men waiting to take what they had found. Anonymous survey stakes began to appear overnight, hammered into the frozen ground just outside the legal boundaries of the Mackie claim. Whoever was planting them wasn't hiding. They wanted the family to know they were being boxed in. Paperwork would follow, lawsuits, challenges, attempts to chip away at the rights they held. At the same time, the government sent inspectors without warning. Trucks rolled up the valley with clipboards, cameras, and a tone of suspicion. The officials demanded records, production logs, and proof the Mackies weren't overstepping their boundaries. Every ounce had to be accounted for, every inch of earth justified, as though fortune itself had made them guilty. The tension inside the camp grew as thick as the smoke from their diesel heaters. The family worked in shifts not only on the gold, but on guard duty, standing at the tunnel entrance with rifles slung over their shoulders, watching the ridges for signs of intruders. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. Too many men had lost fortunes to rivals who struck at the moment of weakness, and the Mackies had painted a target bigger than any claim in the north. Kevin put it bluntly when the crew gathered one night around the lanterns. "We didn't just find gold," he said, his voice flat and steady. "We painted a target on our backs." The words settled heavy over the group, because every one of them knew he was right. The serpent's spine was giving them riches beyond imagination, but it was also drawing the wolves closer with every ounce pulled from the ground. And so they dug on, gold fever, burning brighter than fear, knowing the week wasn't over, and neither was the danger. But fear has a way of seeping in, even when no one admits it. The longer the shadows lingered on the ridges, the shorter their tempers grew. Every whisper of a snapped branch outside camp, every rumor from town, worked its way under their skin until the real enemy wasn't just out there, it was sitting across the fire from them. The days began to blur into one another, every hour measured not by the clock, but by the sound of gravel running through the sluices. Fatigue no longer came in waves, it lived in their bones. The Mackies fought the earth, the cold, and now each other. Arguments flared over fuel, over shifts, over whether they were digging for fortune or digging their own graves. Kevin barked orders with less patience than ever, his voice cracking from exhaustion. His son snapped back, tired of bleeding into the ground for a dream he wasn't sure was his. But the gold kept surfacing, shimmering like a devil's promise. By now the family's take was so high that even the thought of stopping seemed impossible. That's when the tunnel collapsed. It happened in a heartbeat, an echoing crack like a gunshot, then the roar of stone and ice folding in. Two of the crew disappeared in a storm of frozen dust. The others dug with bare hands, torches cutting through the dark, until at last the trapped men were dragged out coughing, eyes wide with the terror of nearly being entombed alive. The Mackies stood silent, all of them shaken, all of them realizing how thin the line was between triumph and a mass grave. Medical troubles piled on, frostbitten hands wrapped in rags, skin blistered from torch flames, lungs raw from breathing in fuel fumes that hung heavy in the tunnels. Still, not a single one walked away, because when they weighed the pans, the tally rose higher. The week's count climbed beyond $4.5 million in raw gold, the richest anyone in Yukon had seen in years. They were battered, fractured, near collapse, yet they had struck something that would be remembered. The word spread far beyond their camp. Locals spoke of the Mackies in hushed tones at bars and supply posts. "They've found the last true mother lode," some whispered. Old men compared it to Bonanza Creek, the strike that ignited the Klondike Rush more than a century ago. For the first time in decades, people believed history was repeating itself. But whispers carried something darker too, a belief that the earth doesn't give up treasure this rich without a price. Superstitions resurfaced, miners claiming the ground was cursed, that anyone who took too much too fast was doomed to lose more than gold. Inside the tunnels, strange things unsettled the crew. Tools misplaced and later found buried in the wrong shaft. Shadows seen flickering against the cavern wall when no lights were burning. One night, a lantern went out on its own, plunging half the team into black silence until a spark reignited it. Some said the air was playing tricks. Others swore the tunnels had a presence. Kevin Mackie himself, worn down but unshaken, muttered to no one in particular, This isn't just gold, it's something older calling us deeper. The family's triumph was undeniable, but it was soaked in dread. They had what they wanted, a strike worth millions. Yet every ounce pulled from the serpent's spine felt like tightening a noose. By the end of the week, the numbers told the tale. More than $4.5 million in raw gold had been pulled from beneath the ice. Enough to change the family's fate, enough to etch their name permanently into Yukon history. But their triumph came at a cost. The tunnels unstable, the family divided, the camp watched by rivals and shadowed by corporations already plotting to move in. Standing above the frozen valley, the Mackies knew they had reached the crown of their discovery. But whether it was a crown or a curse, none could yet say. Rivals circled like wolves. Inspectors combed their paperwork, and even the government now eyed their claim with suspicion. The gold was theirs for now, but everyone wanted a piece of it. The family's debate turned bitter. Should they dig deeper, defend the strike at any cost, or walk away while they were still alive to enjoy what they had won? Every option carried ruin along with reward. They had carved themselves into legend, but legends were just as often graves as they were crowns. The Yukon had its new story now, one written in frost, blood, and glittering treasure. Whether the Mackies would remain kings of that story or end up as its ghosts was a question the frozen valley would answer in time. If you've been hooked by the Mackies' fight for Yukon gold, hit that like button, subscribe for more unbelievable discoveries, and don't miss what happens when the next strike shakes the north.